Good morning. Where is the global economy now, and where is it going? This is the title of the session today. And how does the European crisis affect on the perspectives of the global recovery? And especially, what should Europe do to address its main problems, which are very, very evident? That means the consequences of the fiscal adjustments, the very hard fiscal adjustments in some cases, its financial instability, the fragility of its banking system, and of its common currency, the euro. We will speak about this today with Nemat Shafik, but we will also speak about the glasses through which this crisis is seen and analyzed, because Nemat Shafik comes from the IMF. I will present her in 1 minute. And the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is the first important international institutions which adopted a new pair of glasses, let's say, to analyze the economy and to analyze the crisis. And the IMF questioned in the last 3 years some pillars of the economic theory and analysis, like the fiscal multipliers, or even the freedom of capital flows. And more recently, it came out with a paper, maybe we can talk about it, about how to restructure public debt, which is a main topic which we discuss in Europe now. So let me introduce our discussant today. I'm very, very pleased to introduce you to Nemat Shafik. She is a Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. She was born in Egypt. And she previously served as a permanent secretary of the UK's Department for International Development, the DFID. And she has been the youngest ever vice president of the World Bank, where she started to work some years ago, when she was only 36 years old. I would like also to mention, and then I will let her speak, of course, that she was named in 2009 the Woman of the Year for Global Leadership and Global Diversity. Thank you. Minouche.
Thank you, Tom. I think I'm going to... Okay, good morning. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah? Good. First, I wanted to say how delighted I am to be here this morning. The people I work with are often lamenting the fact that there isn't enough public discourse about the big issues of the day, and particularly some of the big economic challenges that the world faces. And I just wanted to congratulate the people of Trento and the organizers of this event for creating exactly that, an opportunity for experts, the public, the media, to talk about the big issues that we face. And I was just saying to one of the organizers, you need to globalize this event, and there should be a Trento in every country. So, and I would be happy to attend all of them. So, what I thought I'd do this morning is speak very briefly about 3 things. First, what are the big long-term global issues, global trends that are shaping our world today? Second, what is the current state of the crisis, particularly in Europe? And third, how do we manage this crisis in light of these wider global trends? So let me start with four trends that I'm going to highlight, and most of them will be pretty familiar. The first is obviously the changing balance of economic power in the world today. We all know that economic and political power is moving from west to east and from north to south. If you look at this chart, which shows where GDP shares are today and where they'll be in 2030, which is really very, very near. And what this reflects is the huge progress that Asia has made in recent years. Over the last 30 years, Asia's share of world GDP has gone from 10% to 30%. Living standards have increased 6-fold, and 500 million people have lifted themselves out of poverty. That's a phenomenal achievement in historical standards. So by 2030, the economy of India will be roughly the same size as the European Union. And the economy of China will be more than double the size of the European Union. So that's the first big global trend. The other big global trend is demographics. This shows you what's happening to population growth rates now for the next, until 2025, for 25 years thereafter, and for the remainder of the century. We all know the story about Europe aging. In other parts of the world, though, of course, the story is very different. In the Middle East and North Africa, 60% of the population is below the age of 30. In sub-Saharan Africa, 70% of the population is below the age of 30. Figure that really strikes me, by 2025, which is 12 years away, it's very soon, 2/3 of the world's population will be Asian. I'll say that again. 2/3 of the world will be Asian, 1/3 will be non-Asian. But of course, aging will also come to Asia. And so in the second half of the century, you see that it's not just Europe that's aging and going through demographic decline. Aging also will come to Asia and to Latin America, in large part because of China's one-child policy. So that's the second big global trend. Let me turn to the issue of climate. We all know that the climate has been very weird lately. 2012 was the hottest year, one of the hottest years on record. The projections about what's going to happen to global temperatures are very wide, and there's a lot of uncertainty. But the impact of even a relatively small temperature change of 2.5 degrees Celsius in terms of the impact on economics is pretty significant. On the left, you see the impact in terms of percent loss in GDP, and you see for countries like India and for Africa, one is seeing very big 4, 5, 6% loss in GDP from climate change. The last and the fourth theme I'll talk about is income distribution. This data is for the United States. It shows what share of national income goes to labor versus capital. And you see a very sharp decline from having had about 2/3 of national income, 67% go to labor, has dropped to about below 57-58%. This is a product of many things, globalization, technology, policy choices that have been made. But it's a phenomenon that we're seeing in many parts of the world, in Europe, in China, in Africa. Someone told me that Trento is the democratic Davos. Well, even in undemocratic Davos, when participants were asked to vote, what was the #1 issue that they were worried about? It was inequality. It's interesting. And a recent Pew poll in Europe showed that, particularly in Southern Europe, people were worried that economic systems were highly unfair, and the prospects for their own children were bleak, and they thought their children would be worse off than they were. So inequality, huge, huge issue. So let me turn to my second theme, which is, where are we in the crisis? Where are we today? And where is the world economy today? If you look at financial markets, they're booming. Financial markets are looking quite robust. Stock markets in the US, in Europe, in Asia are rising to levels that we haven't seen since the crisis in 2008. And spreads for European sovereigns have come down pretty considerably. But what we see when you look beneath that is actually, when you look at the real economy, you see a much more complicated story. On the real economy side, we see what we're calling a 3-speed recovery. You have those parts of the world which are growing at high speed, mainly the emerging markets and low-income countries. And then you have the economies that are growing at medium speed. Essentially, the US, which is now starting to see some recovery, will grow by about 1.9% this year and somewhere near possibly 3% next year. And then you have the parts of the world that are growing at a slow speed, and that's essentially Europe and Japan. Underlying this 3-speed recovery is also the fact that the real economies are growing very slowly and have generated a huge unemployment crisis in many parts of the world. This graph on the left shows you what unemployment looks like in Europe and the Middle East, where the problem is most acute, compared to the rest of the world. And while the rest of the world is facing unemployment rates of 5-6%, in Europe and the Middle East, we're seeing rates that are double that. In Italy, for example, we recently had results which showed an unemployment level of 12%, and for young people, about 38%. Really unacceptably high levels of unemployment. Now, the research is very clear. How do you get employment up? economies have to grow. You can do some micro things to alter employment levels, but the real solution to unemployment is economic growth. And in Europe, growth is very held back by the financial fragmentation that we're seeing across the Eurozone. This is an illustration of that fragmentation. We know the ECB is keeping interest rates very low to try and encourage the growth of credit and the economic recovery. But that low interest rate for corporates in France and Germany is translating into borrowing rates of 4%. But for countries like Italy and Spain, firms are facing much higher rates of 5–6%. And if you looked at Portugal and Greece, you'd see even higher rates. And if you looked at small and medium enterprises in those countries, you'd see that they were facing borrowing rates that were far higher. So a huge problem in terms of getting credit flowing in the economy, getting firms able to invest and create jobs. Now, it's important to remember that we've actually done quite a lot. I mean, I know that Europe bashing has become fashionable, but it's important to look back and see all the things that have happened in Europe. Sometimes a bit inelegantly, probably too many late-night summits with bleary-eyed ministers emerging, making somewhat coherent statements. But in the end, at every critical juncture, some key decisions were made. And if you go back, you can see that both at the pan-European level and at the national level, a whole variety of good decisions were made. And the one I would highlight really as having been a key turning point was last summer when Super Mario Draghi announced the so-called OMT, the Outright Monetary Transmission Program, where he said, we will do whatever it takes to save the euro. And that took away the fear of imminent euro breakup and calmed markets down considerably. But despite the fact that quite a lot has been done, there's still a long way to go. And there are three areas that I'd highlight that are necessary to solve the euro crisis. The first is banking union. And again, there are three key elements. The single supervisory mechanism, bringing all of the key European banks under the supervision of the ECB. The single resolution authority, so that when a bank fails in some part of Europe, that the burden of saving that bank doesn't fall on the sovereign of one country, and so it would have to be supported by a common backstop, a common pool of funds to bail out that bank. And then thirdly, a common safety net, so that deposits across the Eurozone are equally safe and people feel confident leaving their deposits anywhere in the zone. So banking union is still a key missing piece of the architecture. The other key missing piece of the architecture is fiscal union. In most monetary unions, in fact, in all monetary unions, it's normal that there are periods when one part of the union is suffering a difficult economic shock relative to others. And in most unions, you find some way to cushion those shocks, either through a central budget. In the European case, it's quite small, the central budget, about 1% of European GDP. In most monetary unions, you see something between 5 and 15% of GDP. And you find ways to cushion the risks so that, for example, if unemployment goes up in one part of the union, you have a central pool to pay that unemployment insurance until the cycle has passed. So it's a very political set of choices around what a fiscal union would look like in Europe. That's up to the politicians to decide, but there are many models out there, and I would be happy to talk about them, about how different federations organize cushioning and sharing risks across an economic union. And then the third area where we need to complete the architecture, so banking union, fiscal union, and then structural reforms for growth. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But just to illustrate the kind of structural reforms that one would want to see to get a recovery in Europe. Here's an example for Italy. Now, we know there's a long list of reforms that Italy could do to improve the productivity of the economy, reforms of product markets, labor markets, and so on. We did some initial estimates about what would the impact on Italian growth be if these measures were taken. And of course, what you find is that any one measure, changing the way the labor market works, changing the hours that shops can be open, changing the way some of the professions are regulated, has a very modest impact. But if you accumulate them across all of them, and accumulate them over time, over 5 years, you can see a gain in Italy's GDP of between 5 or 6%, which for an economy that has seen almost no growth in the last decade is a huge impact. So the payoff to structural reforms can be significant, but it takes time, and you have to do a lot of them. Any particular one doesn't achieve very much. So let me come to my final theme, which is how do we cope with the current crisis in light of those long-term global trends that I mentioned at the beginning? And now I can put away my clicker. The shift in global economic power. There is a bit of a, how can I put it, a little bit of a kind of doomsday scenario when people talk about this shift in global economic power. You know, the West is finished, this is the decline of the advanced economies, et cetera, et cetera. I don't believe that. One can't think of the global economy as a zero-sum game. These gains in income, particularly in Asia, also create huge opportunities. The biggest risk today for Europe is the risk of stagnation, the risk that it won't be possible to pull together these reforms at the national and the European level to see a recovery in growth. And one has seen what that does to a society. If you look at what's happened to Japan over the last 20 years, where there has been almost no growth in an aging society. So what does Europe need for the period ahead? We need a period in which monetary, fiscal, and structural policies need to be completely focused on restoring growth in Europe. Europe's relative economic size in the world economy may decline, but in absolute terms, you can still be much better off. And if you think in per capita terms, you can be much, much better off. So I think that's possible. It can be done, but it will require an ambitious set of reforms at both the national and the European level. Now, how do you cope with the changing demographics that I mentioned in the beginning, aging societies and so on? Well, I'm afraid we've all reconciled ourselves to the fact that we're going to be working much longer, that, you know, that retirement when you're 60 kind of thing that we'd all been hoping for is probably not going to happen. So we'll all have to work a little bit longer. And the other key way of coping with this demographic challenge is the role of women. I know today is the day, the anniversary of when women first voted in Italy, so congratulations to all of you. And it's a good day to remind ourselves that Italian women are an incredibly underutilized resource in this country and across many countries in Southern Europe. Highly educated, highly skilled, but one of the lowest labor force participation rates in the OECD economies. Why is that? Inadequate childcare, not affordable, not high quality, a tax system that doesn't, for second earners, that doesn't necessarily encourage women to join the labor force. And I hate to say it, Italian men who have to help a little bit more at home. But if those things could change, think how much more productive Italy could be, and many other countries in Southern Europe, and Japan for that matter, because Japan has an identical demographic and labor force pattern. Now, what about inequality? Inequality is a huge economic and political problem. We've done some recent research in the IMF which shows that countries that are highly unequal have a hard time sustaining growth over the medium term. So huge economic problem, but also huge political problem. And we've seen it in countries like Greece, where people felt that the burden of economic adjustment and the crisis has not been borne fairly, and in particular, higher income people who haven't been paying their tax. So the inequality issue is a huge challenge which does need to be addressed if we're going to get out of this recovery and sustain the progress. And then finally, on the issues like climate change and the pan-EU issues like banking and fiscal union. The theme of this conference in some ways is very appropriate to those challenges, that sovereignty is being challenged. And I fear that by definition, the nature of this interdependent world in which we live will mean that we will have to sacrifice sovereignty, all of us. We need increased cooperation at the EU level to complete the architecture of the monetary union and to make it work.
We need sacrifices of sovereignty at the global level to cope with problems like climate change, to better regulate financial systems and banks which cross borders, to reinvigorate world trade, and to address problems like climate, which by definition need global interdependence. I was trying to think of a good metaphor to describe this world, this increasingly globalized world, which requires more cooperation in order to manage its affairs. And I was reminded of the poem by a 16th century English poet called John Donne, which, if you recall, said, "No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And if a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the loss." It's interesting, he mentioned Europe. "Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind. And therefore, never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." And that is the world, even though this was in the 16th century that he wrote this, that we live in more than ever. So none of us is an island. And sovereignty will have to be sacrificed a bit in order to solve these challenges. But there are some advantages to not being an island and being together. And I think those advantages exceed the costs of the sacrifices of sovereignty. So I will stop there and look forward to Tonja's, I'm sure, very challenging questions and yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I'll go back to Europe, where we're going through a very severe recession, and especially in Italy. And I will go back to the question I mentioned before of the fiscal multipliers, because this is not only a question of interpreting the reality or the economics, and of revising the outlooks continuously in a very hard way. This is also about politics, because this, for example, explains why the managing director of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, was the first to say, well, for Greece, there will be, we will have to restructure the debt. No, it won't be enough to make fiscal adjustments to go on with this very hard austerity. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity to speak about this question of the fiscal multipliers and of the, with you, Minouche, and even maybe to comment on the last developments, because someone is saying, well, Greece is back on track already. And someone else is saying, no, it will need another restructuring of the debt. Where is the truth?
Okay. Maybe I'll start just by giving a bit of background on this fiscal multipliers debate, because it was a very hot debate in economic circles, but I'm not sure the rest of the world followed it as much as we did. But we had an analysis that appeared about 9 months ago, which looked at what happened to economies when they contract their fiscal policy. And normally in the IMF, we kind of have a rule of thumb. If you cut a fiscal deficit by 1% of GDP, the economy will decline by about 0.5% of GDP. So our multiplier, our rule of thumb multiplier, was about 0.5. But what we found is that in some countries, in 1 or 2 years, where there was a so-called liquidity trap and interest rates were caught were really at the lower bound of what's possible, that the multipliers were actually far higher. So in a country like Greece in 2010-11, the multiplier was much higher than 0.5. So when the government reduced the budget deficit, the impact on growth was far more negative than we had anticipated. And it's important to emphasize that this applies to a few countries. It doesn't apply to emerging markets. The research shows that it didn't apply later. It only applied in those couple of years. So it's a limited result, but it's also a very strong result. I think when that result emerged from our research, we immediately started to adjust our programs in many of these countries. So we argued that Greece, that Spain, that Portugal needed more time. that the so-called austerity policies needed to be phased in more gradually because the impact on growth was so severe that we were actually in a situation where you were fiscally adjusting, growth was declining, and debt was actually going up because the contraction was so severe. Now, in terms of the issues around public debt, you know, I think what we have said in countries like Greece is that, you know, economics is, there's about as much art in it as there is science. And, you know, sometimes people call us the economic doctors, and we come and we deliver this nasty medicine that countries have to take. But, you know, just like with real medicine, different bodies react differently to the same medicine. And so what we have to see is what happens to the Greek economy over the months to come, and if growth begins to recover. But if it doesn't, I think we have to look again at how sustainable the debt is in Greece. And we will continue to monitor it and see whether it can sustain its current debt levels.
There is also another country with a big debt, and it's Italy. Mm. And I said before that you came out with this paper about debt restructuring. I mean, in the end, the first debt restructuring was a success in Greece, no? So it was, some said it will be a disaster. It wasn't a disaster at all. Do you think that, I mean, we're trying to get back on track also and to come out of a very hard recession, one of the most severe recessions in Europe. Now we have a primary surplus, a very generous one. We have a good deficit. We came out of the procedure, the European procedure of excessive deficit. So we are, but still the debt is rising. So what do you think we should do in Italy? You mentioned the reforms to, but do you think we will have to fix more sooner or later the problem with a restructuring of a haircut?
You know, I think Italy's in a very different situation than the situation that we have in Greece. You know, in Greece, we did a private sector debt restructuring, and there was a haircut on private creditors. This recent paper that you mentioned that looked at some of the recent experience with debt restructuring, I think argues that debt restructuring usually is too little, too late. That's the main problem. It comes too late, and if you do it earlier, you can get an economic recovery going much more quickly with much less suffering. But the argument hinges on debt being so big that investors hold back on their investments because they're worried that eventually they're going to be expropriated because there's this big debt overhang hanging over the economy. And if you think about the current situation in Italy, the reason people aren't investing isn't really because of the debt overhang. The reason people aren't investing are because of all of these structural problems in the economy that I mentioned briefly earlier. So I guess our view is that, you know, Italy's achieved quite a lot on the fiscal side, and the fiscal adjustment has been dramatic and impressive, and we don't think there needs to be more fiscal effort, but we also don't think now is the time to loosen up fiscal policy. We think it should be maintained at the current level. We do think that tax is pretty high. The tax burden in Italy is pretty high, and it would be desirable to shift the balance toward reducing spending a bit more and trying to reduce some of the tax burden. But really, the big payoff in Italy will come from structural reforms and to restore growth. And I think that will be far more important than thinking about debt restructuring.
In the last years, we have seen very often the IMF and its managing director, Christine Lagarde, well, quarreling is a bit hard, but she was often contraposed to Angela Merkel, no? Do you think, and there are many fears in the markets that Europe may split one day, no? In a sort of core Europe and core Euro, and the Southern Euro, no? Last year, the Super Mario Draghi, as you called him, well, he reversed a process which was already going on to split Europe. Now we are in a different situation. You mentioned it also, probably because Japan also helps. But do you think that there is still a danger that we have a northern and a southern euro one day?
You know, I think the editor of The Economist, I was at an event with him, and he once said, you know, the Anglo-Saxon world has consistently underestimated the determination of European politicians to keep Europe together and to keep the Eurozone together. I think ultimately it's a political decision, and I've seen no evidence of a political willingness to do anything but keep the Eurozone together. You know, even if you look at polling today in Greece, where you would think dissatisfaction with the euro would be very high, on balance, public opinion is such that people want to stay in the euro. And I think that, you know, last summer when Angela Merkel made it clear that Greece was going to stay in and that Europe would do what it could to keep Greece in the eurozone, I think that was a hugely important signal to markets. And actually, if you look at what happened to spreads for sovereigns in Europe at that point, they came down even further than when OMT was announced. So it showed how politically important that signal was. So, you know, I think it's a political decision. I think the IMF's view is that if you've made that political decision, you can't leave the monetary union incomplete. You have to finish the pieces that are missing, the banking union, the fiscal union. You can't, you know, build this building and leave out these critical pillars, because otherwise it will collapse. So I think that's really where the debate is today.
Everybody knows that the IMF is part of the Troika, so-called. And someone is saying, well, look, they have the debate about the fiscal multipliers. They say that these countries need more time. They say that they need maybe sometimes a restructuring of the debt. But when they are in these countries, no, they behave differently. They're very hard. They go through with the ECB and the European Commission. They torture these countries, you know, as if there were two positions in the IMF, a sort of position of, well, Olivier Blanchard, because it's with the chief economists of the IMF that these changes came, this new pair of glasses, no, let's say. And there's a part of the IMF who doesn't agree. Is this true?
Yeah, I think the IMF has actually been pretty consistent throughout this crisis. The thing that happens is that people who disagree with the IMF imply that there are disagreements within the IMF to make their points. So I think, you know, our view has been very clear from the beginning that there are three different types of countries affected by this crisis. There's one group who are under huge market pressure, who have no alternative but to adjust their budgets and to fiscally consolidate. And those are countries like Greece and Portugal, for whom there is really no alternative until the market pressure abates. The second group of countries is countries that can afford to let their automatic stabilizers take effect. The automatic stabilizers are things like unemployment insurance and other things that fluctuate with the cycle and may increase deficits or not. And there's a group of countries in the middle who fit into that category. And then there's a third group of countries that actually have some fiscal space and can afford to spend a little bit more in the crisis. And that's a very small group of countries, unfortunately. And we've kind of said that throughout the crisis. So I think we've been consistent. Now, different people who have different views use that somewhat complicated message of three different groups of countries to imply, to bolster whatever arguments they have about austerity versus growth. But, you know, frankly, I think this debate about austerity is getting a little bit stale. I think even, you know, within the Troika, and I think it's probably no secret that, you know, within the Troika we had lots of discussions about this issue. You know, the Commission now agrees that fiscal deficit targets should not be kept in nominal terms. You know, it's not 3% or die. We should think in structural terms. And so we have been pushing for structural fiscal targets, and that means targets that, you don't stick to a fixed number, you take the policy measures to achieve a number, but if the economy goes a bit more slowly than we expected and the deficit comes out a bit bigger than we expected, that's okay, you make up for it later. And so I think the acceptance that structural fiscal targets are the way forward has now become the consensus view, which I think is correct, and something I think that the IMF has advocated really since the beginning of the crisis.
2 days ago, we interviewed Mario Monti and Sylvie Goulart. They wrote a book about, and there was a big question about Troika, because Sylvie Goulart said there is no, in the treaties, there's nothing about Troika. As if it was a sort of invention of the crisis and no legitimacy of the Troika. And she said, I'm sure that one day the Troika will be only the European Commission, because the IMF and the ECB will step out. Do you think this is possible?
I think the Troika was a product of the crisis. Normally, when the IMF works with a country in crisis, it's a bilateral relationship. The IMF works with the country, and we negotiate a program, and we agree on what they're going to do in order to get out of the crisis. And so it's a pretty simple process. In Europe, the Troika was necessary for two reasons. One, the countries in the Eurozone don't have their own single central bank. We had to bring the ECB in because they set monetary policy for the zone. And so you couldn't have a discussion about the macroeconomic strategy without the ECB present. And then the Commission became the representative of the other member states, who were in the end providing most of the financing in these programs. So if you look at the Greece program or the Portugal program, the IMF's share of the total financing for these countries is a minority share. It varies by program, but it's between 1/3 and in some cases just 1/10 in some of these, in the recent Cypriot program, for example. So if the major financiers will of course demand a role at the table. I know that there was much debate in Europe about whether the IMF should be brought in to help manage the crisis. And I think those who are closest to the actual management of the crisis will say two things. One, I think I can quote this. I think Mario Monti once said, Europe was not designed for crisis. Europe was only designed for good times. So the mechanisms for dealing with negative shocks, with bank failures, with sovereign debt crises, were not there. They were never designed. And so, that timeline I showed of all the things that have been done in the last year and a half were Europe scrambling to put in place the mechanisms for handling bad times. And frankly, bad times is what we do at the IMF. That's our core business. And so, we have, frankly, for better or worse, unparalleled experience in managing economic crises. And I think Europe felt that if you're in the middle of a crisis, you want someone who's done this before. So I think we brought that expertise on crisis management. And frankly, I think the other thing we brought, which was very valuable, is complete objectivity. We don't have skin in the game in the sense that we're not a member state. We are there to provide objective economic analysis of how we see the numbers and how we see the outcomes and what our experience managing other crises in other parts of the world tells us. And I think it's an advantage in this situation to have someone who's a sort of neutral party. I think it's no secret that, enforcing rules in a club of 17 is quite difficult. The Eurozone is a club of 17, and member states have a very hard time enforcing rules on each other, which is what we learned from Maastricht and the Fiscal Compact and so on. The IMF is a club of 188 countries, and it's much easier to enforce rules in a big club. So I think that's another very important thing that we added to the crisis management, was the objectivity that comes from being a very big club.
But during the crisis, some nervousness came out in the IMF, among the emerging countries, for example. No? So another question, of course, is how long will you paid a quote of the bailouts? I mean, which went a little bit smaller in the case of Cyprus. So this was for someone the sign that the IMF is facing big pressures from inside to say, let's stop with the support to Europe. Is this true?
Well, I think it is fair to say that we were criticized for the European bailouts because there was a view that Europe is a very rich continent. Europe can afford to bail out itself. It doesn't need financing from the rest of the world. And it's true that a significant part of the IMF's exposure now is to Europe. Most of our largest programs are in the Eurozone. But I think, you know, the fact that Europe is so big and the fact that many of these countries became systemically important for the world economy. And, you know, our job one at the IMF is to preserve the soundness of the international financial system and to support the world economy. And if we weren't in these programs and didn't help solve them, there was a real risk that the world economy would be thrown into another massive recession. So I think there's a very clear case for why we were involved. But I think you will see over time a natural evolution whereby as Europe builds its own crisis management mechanisms, the European Stability Mechanism, the move toward a single regulator for the banks, eventually the creation of a common bank resolution framework. I think as you see that completion of the European architecture being put into place, there will be less need for IMF financing. And I hope we can continue to contribute to economic recovery in Europe through our economic advice and objectivity that brings. But I think it is the natural evolution of things that the need for our financing will diminish over time.
I would like to come back to the global, the world. But it's about Europe again. We often forget that the IMF is also much about currencies. And now there is a discussion about currency war, no? Sort of. Well, first I would like to know what you think about this incredible case of Japan, because I mean, most of the financial world is now looking at Japan. That's one of the reasons why we are a little bit stiller, no? There's a little bit more silence on Europe. What is this Japanese experiment about, in your opinion? And is it threatening the euro? Because I mean, now the euro is like in between two very aggressive monetary policies. It's that of Bank of Japan and that of the Fed, no? Do you think this is dangerous for euro and for the ECB, which is much more conservative in his monetary policy?
Mm-hmm. I mean, we think that this talk of currency war is overblown, frankly. And I think if you look at the specific case of Japan, we've just done our annual assessment of the Japanese economy, what we call our Article 4. And I think what we conclude in that is that for most countries in the world, including Europe, the possibility that Japan recovers and starts to grow again, the benefit of that far outweighs any negative effect from the Japanese yen depreciating. There are a small number of countries, maybe like Korea, who compete directly in certain markets with Japan, who might see some negative effects. But for most countries in the world, getting Japan to grow again is in everyone's interest. I think the other thing we think about Japan is that the current, aggressive monetary policy is positive, but it is no substitute for dealing with Japan's fiscal and structural problems, which also have to be addressed. So, you know, as always, monetary policy can only do so much. You have to complement it with other measures to get the recovery, so you can get a temporary boost in growth, but in order for that to last, Japan needs to do some more.
A last question on one of your fields of expertise, which is the Middle East. What is happening there? Because, I mean, there was much attention and much, I don't know, hope for these countries. And what is happening now? What do you think will happen in the future to this? And then maybe we can open to the audience after.
Okay. Yes, I mean, I guess, you know, after every spring there's a hot summer, and I think we're in the hot summer in the Arab world. You know, on the economic side, the numbers don't look very good. They're all sort of moving in the wrong direction. Deficits are up. Unemployment is actually, there are now more than 1 million more people unemployed than when the Arab Spring happened in the region. Debt numbers are up, reserves are down, investment is down, tourism is down. So the overall macro numbers are not looking great. You know, I think we looked at similar transitions in other parts of the world. You know, we looked at what happened in Eastern Europe. If you look at what happened in South Africa with the fall of apartheid. So we looked at a bunch of other countries to try and understand the path of these transitions. And what we found is that in most cases, what I've just described, all these numbers going in the wrong direction, is pretty typical. And it lasts for about 4 or 5 years. Until economies restructure and change and evolve. So, in some sense, this is normal. I think in the region it's particularly difficult because they're trying to have a political transition and an economic transition at the same time, and rewriting constitutions and having lots of elections. And as you well know, those political processes always create economic uncertainty. You know, I think the medium-term fundamentals are quite compelling. The demographics of the region, the strategic location, the economic potential is there. But I think there's a few tough years ahead. Now, many of the countries have come to the IMF for support. We now have programs with Morocco. We're about to agree with Tunisia. We have a program with Jordan, with Yemen. So we're actively trying to support that transition. And I think the key thing is for the neighbors and partners of the region to stay focused on the long term in terms of where we want to get to, which are countries that are more democratic and economically efficient, and provide them with financial support so that that transition goes relatively smoothly rather than explosively.
Thank you. Are there some questions? We'll take 3 and then first opportunity to answer maybe, no?
Okay.
Siamo in Italia.
So, this is Italy. Can you hear? Testing, testing, one. Okay, thank you. So, this is Italy, and we're celebrating the Festival of Economics. And I'd like to remind that among the different papers that led the questioning of multipliers, there's a study of 3 Italian researchers, Battini, Caligari, and Mellina. So Italy has contributed. So in our country, we contribute to the knowledge. So they are not in Italy. They went to work for the International Monetary Fund. But apart from that, there's also a question there. The internationalization processes are not irreversible. If we look at the world today, is there a risk to go backwards? Questioning globalization, is there a risk there for protectionism?
Take maybe one other question. Here it was. Yes, yes, here.
Thank you. This is back to inequality.
We are used to study inequality and study inequality between unskilled and skilled labor, between labor and capital. But there is another kind of inequality which is very dear to me, to my daily life in Italy. That is the inequality between the young and the old. The old people are richer and the young people are poorer. So how do you think this kind of specific inequality can affect the growth issue in Italy, and what could be the policies to tackle it?
Third question, and then, yes, here.
I
have two questions. You talked very political, especially when you were referring to Greece. Over the past 3 years, there are people in the US who had anticipated that the policies by the Troika were basically similar to committing suicide. You talked political in a couple of opportunities. You were referring to Greece, most specifically. Over the past 3 years, there are those in America, the Keynesian school, stating that the policies adopted by the Troika are suicidal for Greece. But nobody commented on that. So we know what the situation is for Greece. There are those that still refer to the problems of Greece. And what about the Arab Spring? I understand that they are going through a hot summer, but this hot summer is closely related also to the upsurge of fundamentalism, because wherever there was an Arab Spring, there was a strong support also of fundamentalists, and this is true in Yemen, in Tunisia, and elsewhere. As for Jordan, well, that is an exception, and Morocco as well. So again, you talked political words.
Very good questions. Let me try and do them a little bit of justice. On the risks, on the risks to globalization and a sort of backlash, no, I think those risks are very real, very real. So far, if you look at things, say, like protectionism in trade, there has actually been surprisingly little protectionism. You know, Pascal Lamy, the head of the WTO, periodically comes out and gives his assessment on where we are. And of course, we're nowhere on the Doha trade round. That's not good. But in terms of the WTO's monitoring of protectionist measures taken by different countries since the crisis, it's actually been relatively modest. So that's a good sign. And, you know, every time the G20 meets, all the leaders recommit themselves to resisting protectionism. But I think my microphone has died. Wait. Oh, there it is. I think it got back. Okay, good. Thank you. So I think there is a risk, but I do think that unless we find better ways to manage globalization, the risk of that backlash will always be there. And the better ways to manage globalization are things like multilateral organizations like the IMF, who try and look at the collective interests and the spillovers and the impact of different policies on the world, through things like, the negotiations on climate change, through international banking regulations, and the trade negotiations. All of those things that try and make sure that the way globalization works is fair are essential underpinnings to sustaining support for it. On inequality, I think you make a very important point on the inequities between the young and the old. The levels of youth unemployment in Europe and the Middle East today are intolerable. There's 200 million people in the world looking for work. About 70 million of those are young people. And we know that the impact of episodes of youth unemployment are very long-lasting. If you don't get into work early in life,
you have lower life expectancy, higher risk of suicide, crime rates go up. I mean, the social consequences are huge. And of course, the economic consequences are huge. So it is a huge problem. Part of the problem, particularly in Southern Europe, is this phenomenon of dual labor markets, where there's one part of the labor market which has high levels of employment protection, generous pensions, high severance payments, very difficult to fire workers, and so on. And another part of the labor market, which is where all the young people are, which is informal, temporary contracts, high turnover, very little employment protection. We think trying to get some convergence in those, to have one labor market, would be hugely beneficial. There are, for example, and you asked for specifics, there are proposals, for example, to have more flexible contracts for new workers and to have employment protection increase with tenure. So you start with relatively lower levels of employment protection. And by employment protection, I mean, firing, severances, redundancy payments, et cetera, and so that it increases over time. But at least young workers then have an entree into the labor market early in their career. So that would be the kind of thing that I think would be very welcome. I'm told in many countries, if you go to some place like Spain, for example, which has now unemployment has reached 26% for all workers, and for young people, it's, almost half of young people are unemployed. I'm told the way it works now is that, it's the grandparents who are keeping the families alive through their pensions and the sort of family solidarity, which is a wonderful thing. But in the end, those young people have to actually be given economic opportunities to contribute rather than being dependents of their grandparents. And so that social contract between the old and the young does need to be renegotiated. And then on the question on Greece and the Arab Spring, I think on Greece had a huge economic adjustment to make. Huge. And there were many aspects of the Greek economy which were clearly unsustainable, both the many fiscal aspects, the early retirement ages, the level of public spending, the level of public employment, and also huge issues of competitiveness. And much of the boom years in Europe, when Greece was able to borrow at very low rates, much of that money went into consumption and real estate and unproductive activities. And then it became unsustainable. And I think, I think in the end, the Greek political system chose to stay in Europe. And that was a clear choice. If you look at the election outcomes, the parties that supported remaining in Europe won most of the votes. And so if Greece is to stay in Europe, some of those unsustainable policies have to be addressed. And, it's not for the IMF to make those political decisions. That's up to the citizens of Greece. But then what we have to honestly say is, okay, if you want to stay in Europe, these are the consequences in terms of your economic policy. And, we have to see what happens. At least the situation has stabilized, and there are some signs of recovery in the markets now, and one has to hope that will continue. And then the Arab Spring, the question was really on the role of fundamentalists. I think it's a bit more complicated than that, because the Arab Spring wasn't really driven by the fundamentalist movement, but they were the ones who were organized. They were the ones who had they had people on the ground. They had an ability to mobilize and organize and bring out the vote. And I think it's not surprising that they've done relatively well in these early elections. But I think this is a dynamic process, and we will see how other political movements organize in the years ahead.
We take some 3 questions more here.
About the problem that we have in Europe about unemployment and high borrowing costs for companies in the periphery of the Eurozone. Do you think would be good for Europe to solve these problems to have the ECB doing even more, for example, buying assets or loan banking, non-performing loans or things like this to help a credit flow to the real economy. Thank you.
Second question was out there.
Gerald Weber, I'm coming from Austria. So we don't have a real unemployment problem here, but my question is in the interest of the unemployed people in Southern Europe. So I question the economic theories of the IMF. I really don't understand why there is no reference to the paradigms which have been developed in the 1930s in the Great Depression. In my opinion, Greece, Portugal and Spain are in a debt deflation situation, and overall GDP is just money times velocity of money. And I never see analysis of this kind, maybe not enough money or not enough velocity of money is in these systems, in the Greek economy, in the Spanish or Portuguese economy, to produce enough GDP. So I question the approach of the reforms you addressed, which might also be helpful, of course. But at the basic, I would like to address the analysis which has been done by Marina Eccles in February of 1933, where these concepts of money and velocity of money were put forward to address the causality of the Great Depression.
Thank you. Third question. There is one out there. Thank you.
Scusate.
Well, fine. So we have heard about some important issues, one of these being the North-South gap worldwide, the other one being linked to the fact that we have an age gap, a gap between the old and the young. Today we have problems of democracy. When democracy is supported, it should also contribute to the development and to the economic growth, therefore allowing millions of individuals to come out of poverty. But I've heard also two words. These are structural reforms, and I've always heard about them. At every meeting, everybody claims we need structural reforms. You have listed them, and that was very clear. We finally understood what it is all about. But on the other hand, there is another new word, which is debt restructuring. So my question is, why do we... Yes, you spoke about this. Yes, but which is your question? Yeah, I'm coming to the question now, sorry. Sure, I do not want to give a presentation myself, but I'm coming to the question. The question is, I mean, if we believe that there is a correlation, I mean, why don't we give more time to our structural reforms? If this is going to sort out the whole issue. Because in this case, we would have more democracy. Because everybody would feel responsible. And this would put together the North, the South, the young and the old. Democracy, that's a word. Why do we go on talking about these structural reforms?
The first question on the ECB. I think we have been of the view that the ECB could do more. We've been very supportive of the measures they've taken so far in terms of keeping interest rates low, in terms of the OMT policy. But we do think that that more could be done because it's clear that we haven't solved the issue yet of financial fragmentation across Europe. The evidence that we see in terms of
borrowing costs to firms across the South shows that that the monetary transmission mechanism is not working yet. And I think the ECB is looking at a variety of alternative mechanisms that it could use to try and fix that problem. So we would be very supportive of that. I think on the issue about the IMF's response to the crisis and the 1930s and so on, I mean, I think it's important. You know, to be frank, I think there's a slightly out-of-date view of the IMF. You know, when the crisis hit in 2008 and Lehman collapsed, the IMF, who, you know, some of you may know the joke that IMF stands for it's mostly fiscal, because no matter what problem we saw, we would say, oh, it's mostly fiscal, you need to reduce your budget spending. You know. But actually, in 2008, we did not say it's mostly fiscal. We said, actually, you need to spend more. We told most countries at the time of the crisis that in order to avoid what happened in the 1930s, which is when the crisis hit, everyone consolidated at the same time, and you had a Great Depression, we told countries to spend, and we told them to cushion the shock of the adjustment. So I think it's unfair to say we didn't learn the lessons of the 1930s. In fact, we were at the forefront of trying to prevent a repeat of the 1930s. And then since then, I think we've been very strong advocates for giving many countries more time, because of course when everybody spent more in 2008, deficits grew, and then countries had to unwind that and figure out how to get their budgets back into order. And we have argued for many countries, including Greece, including Spain, and including Portugal, and including countries that went into the crisis quite early, like Iceland, who we agreed that Iceland should actually spend more when the crisis first hit, and actually only very gradually restore fiscal discipline. So we've been quite heterodox and unorthodox in the advice we've given to countries. And then just one last thing on the kind of view of the IMF. You know, there's a little bit of a perception that the IMF goes around and imposes austerity on poor countries. And we recently looked at a study, we put together a study of a group of countries that had programs with the IMF and a group of countries that didn't have programs with the IMF. And we looked at what happened to spending that was focused on the needs of poor people in those countries. And what we found is that the countries that had IMF programs actually were able to spend more on poverty-focused spending than countries that didn't have IMF programs. And that increasingly in the IMF programs, we set floors on the minimum amounts you must spend on the needs of the poor or on education and health. So I think the IMF has moved on quite a bit, but the perception of us hasn't quite caught up with the new reality. And then lastly, on the structural reforms questions, you know, it's funny. You know, I too get sick of hearing about structural reforms. Because it's become this kind of catchphrase for all the difficult things that aren't monetary and fiscal. And it's hard to really know what it means. You know, I'll give you an example which we often cite, which just illustrates what it means, structural reforms. And I'll use an example from Greece, which we often tell. You know, Greece is a very sunny country, right? Very warm. But Greece imports tomatoes from the Netherlands. You may ask why. And the reason is that the internal trucking costs within Greece to transport tomatoes from one bit of the country to the cities are so high because the trucking union has such a tight monopoly on internal transport that it's actually cheaper to fly the tomatoes in from a greenhouse in the Netherlands into Athens. That is structural reform. Fixing the issues about domestic internal transport, which create these huge inefficiencies in a country. And the problem we have with structural reforms is I could give you 10 anecdotes like that similar anecdote about electricity prices in Italy and Spain, which are far higher than competitors because of the way that utilities in the non-tradable sectors are regulated in these countries. There are lots of these small microeconomic stories, each of which reduces the competitiveness and productive capacity of a country. And they're not very sexy. They're not one headline where a politician can go out and say, I'm going to change this and we're going to grow by 2% more. And they also, each one doesn't produce a big benefit, but it's an important part of the reform process. But each one has an interest group that is deeply attached to that protection. And for a politician to have to tackle each of those interest groups, the accountants, the lawyers, the truckers, the the shopkeepers, is very difficult. And you don't get a big payoff from each one. So this is why structural reforms are so difficult. And that's why I think the point I was making is they're very difficult, but they're really important. And if you do enough of them, they add up to big gains in growth. And that's where Europe is today. That's where the big challenge is for Europe, is to try and restore growth by doing these difficult things. And that's why this forum is so important, because unless there's public consensus about the importance of doing this, it's very hard for politicians to get it done.
Maybe we can take the last 3 questions if you're still...
Sure,
okay.
Happy to.
Are there other questions? 1, 2? The microphone is stuck somewhere.
My question goes back to the lessons that we should have learned from the depression from the 30s. And I fully agree with the need of structural reforms. And the examples that you gave are, they just speak for themselves. And I fully agree on that. But I think there are some economists who sustain that the road out of the depression is very clear and proven. It has been proven through the depression of the 30s, and there are lessons that should have been learned. And these lessons have not been brought to bear in the European crisis. We need someone that spends our way out of this depression. Maybe in Italy we are not in a position to do that. Certainly Greece was not in a position to do that, but other countries are in the position to do that. And I wonder why you, as an objective, third-party, worldwide organization, you didn't put forward this issue strong enough. Maybe because you didn't want to get in trouble with the main leading powers in Europe?
Thank you. The second question was there, I think. Now here.
Yeah, thank you. I had one question which is very similar to the other one. The first one is if austerity nowadays is a kind of modern, new, adapted phase of neoliberalism. So a kind of neoliberalism with a German face, thanks to the German School of Economics, just to say. The second question is, there is a strong debate, and I think Colin Crunch talked about it, about the topic of the strange non-death of neoliberalism, and why, in many ways, we are still in the Washington Consensus. So, are we still in the Washington Consensus because the Keynesian consensus was not good enough, and so it is better to have the Washington Consensus, or just because it's much more complicated to reverse? And finally, just a curiosity, because sometimes reading papers and listening to debates, there are some scholars, maybe much more from the Warwick University than the others, but there are many who say that the Troika is implementing for Europe the same medicine for Latin America in many ways. But in the end, it is not clear how we will manage to come out of the crisis. Thanks.
Thank you. And the third and last question. No last question. Okay.
Okay, I think those were big enough. Let me try and take them as a group because they're related. I mean, first I'd say on the issue of why didn't we tell the surplus countries in Europe to support the recovery because they had room. I mean, the fact is we did. You know, in the triage of countries, I said, we did say there were some countries that had fiscal room, and if they stimulated their economies, that would have spillover benefits for the rest of Europe. There were very few. There was Germany, there was the Netherlands when the crisis started, who had some fiscal room, and we urged them to use it. Now, they didn't necessarily listen to us, although, you know, despite the German rhetoric, if you actually look at their numbers, German fiscal policy has been mildly, you know, not hugely stimulative, but mildly stimulative in the recent period. But they weren't super stimulative. The other thing I'd say is that I don't want to leave you with the impression that we think the entire answer to the European crisis is in national level structural reforms. We also argue very strongly that there needs to be pan-European action, and that a key part of that pan-European action is dealing with this financial fragmentation. You know, when firms, and particularly small and medium firms in Spain, in Italy, in Portugal, in Greece, can access credit, you know, firms that are commercially sound and in good shape can access credit for the same low rates of interest that we see in Northern Europe, then we'll start to see signs of recovery. And that can only happen with pan-European action. We also need to see pan-European action on the banks. You know, there are still banks in Europe that are constrained, that don't have enough capital, that haven't dealt with non-performing loans on their books. Again, we need pan-European action so that there is a common pool to recapitalize and help those banks restructure, clean up their balance sheets, and get back into the business of lending to the economy. So there are a number of areas where we think there needs to be collective action at the European level, including on fiscal union. We've just put out a paper which says that, as I said, that there are many models for European fiscal union, but having some mechanism for sharing the risks. So when unemployment shoots up in one part of the union, that there's some central pot of money that helps pay the increased burden of unemployment payments until the cycle passes. And one of the interesting things that study shows is that, you know, we did some what we call backcasting. You know, you go back in time and say, if you had had a fiscal union in Europe from 1999 onwards, how would the money have been transferred? Because there's a perception that a fiscal union means that basically Germany pays for everybody else. It's not true. If you go back to 1999, every country in Europe has had ups and downs. There are periods historically when Germany would have been a net recipient of EU funds, and there are periods when they would have been a contributor. That's the point about risk sharing and risk pooling, is that everybody, it's normal in business cycles that there are ups and downs, and if you pool your resources, you're able to cushion those ups and downs a bit more easily. So we've been putting these arguments and this research out there to try and shape and contribute to the debate in Europe, and I hope we've been even-handed in that process. In terms of the so-called Washington consensus, I mean, I guess I would, I think that's a phrase that's a bit out of date now, because there really isn't a Washington consensus. I think there's a more pragmatic consensus. If you look at the kinds of policies that we've been advocating in recent years, they run counter to what the conventional wisdom is on Washington consensus. We've argued for monetary accommodation, we've argued for more gradual fiscal adjustment, we've argued for capital controls in many countries, and we've had capital controls in some of our programs in countries like Iceland, for example. So I think that, you know, the crisis was a critical moment for us at the fund. I think, you know, frankly, we didn't predict the crisis. We should have, but I think it made us realize it was very important to be self-critical and very, you know, open to some unconventional thinking, and also much more cognizant of the interconnections and spillovers in the world economy. And I think all of that has informed our thinking. And, you know,
I often like to quote Keynes, who once said, when the facts change, I change my mind. And so the facts changed, and the IMF changed its mind on many policies. And I think that makes us a much more relevant institution for a world economy that's very different today than it was 20 years ago.
Let me pose you last question, because you mentioned it so. The banking union. Well, 1 year ago, we had a very important agreement in Europe about this banking union. You mentioned it twice or three times. So, but now, at 1 year of distance, the impression is maybe that, well, the markets are calm now, or more calm than 1 year ago, because they're distracted by Japan. And the impression is that this process is slowing very much down. I mean, the supervision is going on, but the resolution mechanism is stucking and the guarantee fund is stucking. Aren't you a little bit afraid that this apparent calm on the markets may slow down in a very risky way the integration process of the European Union, also in the banking union?
I sometimes say that the process of resolving the crisis in Europe has been what I call just-in-time integration. So, a crisis hits, you get together, you have a late-night summit, and then you agree, and you kind of go one step further. It hasn't been a kind of strategic, long-term planning approach to crisis management. But, that is the political reality, I'm afraid, that, it's when pressures come that it focuses the mind, and you have to act. It's not, as I said, it's not always elegant, but that is the reality. Now, on the banking union, we did have some important progress. I think that there's been a decision to phase it, and I think there was a view that the single supervisory mechanism, whereby the key European banks will be supervised by the ECB, was seen as a precondition for having a common resolution mechanism. And the key issue there, as you probably know, are legacy assets. Who's going to pay for the legacy problem of banks? And I think there was an appetite for European solidarity going forward, but not necessarily for cleaning up the past. And so it's key to get the single supervisory mechanism in place first, and then I think we will see progress on resolution. I think we have argued that a common resolution fund is an essential precondition if you're going to break the link between the sovereigns and the banks, and so that they're not completely interdependent. I think there's an emerging consensus on that, although I do think that there is a timing issue. I think we all agree that deposit insurance can wait a little bit. That's not as pressing as the other two pieces. But the single supervisory mechanism will take some time to put into place. And for the ECB is hiring hundreds and hundreds of bank supervisors at the moment to put in place the capacity to be able to supervise these hundreds of European banks. So that will take some time. But I think we all agree that the sooner we can make progress on this, the better, because it's the only way that you're going to start to see some improvement and some reintegration of European financial markets and the beginning of more affordable credit for firms, particularly in the periphery. So it's a key precondition.
Thank you very, very much, Nemat Shafik. Buon proseguimento.